I used to draw lines for a living. Property boundaries, zoning overlays, floodplains and easement corridors. I was a GIS cartographer for the Fayette County Planning Office in southern West Virginia. And my entire professional identity rested on the assumption that the land could be known, that every ridge, hollow, drainage ditch, and decommissioned rail spur could be captured in clean geometries and filed in a database that would outlast the people who created it. I believed in maps the way some people believe in prayer, not because they answered every question, but because they imposed an order that made the chaos survivable. My name is Joel Brannick, and on the morning everything ended, I was running a property audit for a timber company east of Fayetteville. The disputed parcel sat against a limestone bluff overlooking a stretch of the New River Gorge that had been logged, reforested, logged again, and finally abandoned when the access road washed out in a flood 16 years earlier. The timber company wanted to reopen the road. The county wanted an updated boundary survey. I wanted to finish before Thursday because my daughter, Cass, had a soccer tournament in Beckley, and I'd already missed the last two. That was Monday. By Wednesday, Cass's tournament had been canceled. By Thursday, Beckley was a perimeter zone. By Friday, I was standing in the rain at the edge of a road that no longer led anywhere, listening to a woman I'd never met tell me she knew where we could go underground. The first broadcast came through the truck radio while I was parked at the trailhead eating a gas station sandwich. Not an emergency alert, those had been cycling all week with increasing urgency, the tones blurring into background noise the way car alarms do in a city. This was a local AM station out of Oak Hill, and the host's voice had the stripped, flat quality of someone who had moved past panic into a kind of mechanical narration. He was reading a list of road closures. Then he stopped reading and said, very quietly, that his producer had just locked the studio door from the inside, and that he could see someone in the parking lot eating a dog. I turned the radio off. Then I turned it back on, because silence was worse. By that point, I'd seen enough online footage to understand the general shape of what was happening, even if the word for it still felt absurd in my mouth. The infection had broken out of containment in 3 eastern seaboard cities simultaneously, or that was the prevailing theory, though timelines kept collapsing under new data. What mattered for my purposes was the local reality. The governor had activated the National Guard. Interstate 64 was closed in both directions between Charleston and Lewisburg, and cell service was failing in rolling blackouts that followed no pattern I could identify. I called Cass. The call connected on the 3rd attempt. She was at her mother's house in Beckley with my ex-wife, Dana, and Dana's husband, Rick. She sounded calm, which scared me more than hysteria would have. 15-year-olds are not supposed to sound calm when the world is breaking. "Dad, are you coming?" she asked, and I said yes, with the complete conviction of a man who had not yet looked at a map and understood what the road closures actually meant. I looked at the map. I pulled up the county GIS layer on my laptop, which still had a cached version from that morning's audit. The closures formed a rough arc from Gauley Bridge down through Raynell and across to Princeton. Beckley sat inside that arc like a seed inside a closing fist. Every route I could trace from my current position to Cass's location crossed at least one closure point, most of them bridged river crossings where guard units would be staged. I am a man who draws lines, and every line I drew dead-ended. That was when I heard the first sound that didn't belong to the woods. A wet, arrhythmic dragging, like a heavy branch being pulled through mud, except the cadence shifted, paused, and shifted again, as though the thing creating it was remembering how to walk. I did not look. I started the truck. The road out of the trailhead was a single-lane gravel track with no turnaround for a quarter-mile. I drove it faster than I should have, the truck fishtailing on wet stone. And when I reached the county blacktop, I turned south without thinking. Which was wrong. South took me deeper into the gorge, away from every functional route to Beckley. I corrected at the first wide spot, executing a three-point turn that felt like it lasted a full minute, and headed north toward Route 19. 2 miles up, I found the first car. It was a silver Honda Civic, nosed into the drainage ditch at an angle that suggested the driver had swerved hard and failed. Both front doors were open. There was a child's booster seat in the back, empty, and a dark smear on the passenger headrest that I chose not to examine. I slowed, scanned the tree line, saw nothing moving, and kept driving. Route 19 was supposed to be the spine of everything, the main artery connecting Fayetteville to Beckley. 4 lanes, well-maintained, the kind of road you take for granted until it's not there. I reached the on-ramp and found it blocked by a jackknifed fuel tanker and 2 state police cruisers parked nose to nose. No officers visible. The cruiser lights were still cycling, painting the wet asphalt in alternating blue and red, and the tanker was leaking something that pooled in the road with an iridescent sheen. I pulled onto the shoulder and sat there, with my hands on the wheel, watching the lights pulse, trying to reconstruct a plan. That's when the woman appeared. She came out of the tree line on the opposite side of the road, walking fast but not running, with the deliberate pace of someone conserving energy for distance. She was maybe 50, short gray hair, wearing a rain jacket 2 sizes too large and carrying a child on her hip, a boy, maybe 3, face buried against her neck. Behind her came a man roughly my age, heavy-set, limping badly, holding a tire iron. I rolled down my window. The woman changed direction immediately and came straight for the truck. "Is there fuel in this?" she asked. No greeting, no preamble. Her accent was local, the vowels rounded in the way that marks someone from the southern coalfields. "Half a tank. Can you drive us south? I'm trying to go north, Beckley." She shook her head once, firmly. "Beckley's gone. We just came from there." The word "gone" sat between us like a stone dropped into still water. The man with the tire iron reached the truck and stood slightly behind her, breathing hard, scanning the road in both directions. "What do you mean, gone?" I asked, and I could hear my own voice thinning. "I mean the guard pulled out 4 hours ago and there's no perimeter anymore. I mean the hospital is burning. I mean we walked 6 miles through the woods to get here and we are not going back." The boy on her hip hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. "My daughter is in Beckley," I said. The woman looked at me with an expression I would later come to recognize as the specific grief of someone who has already absorbed the blow you haven't yet felt. "Then I'm sorry," she said. "But you can't reach her from here, not on roads." Her name was Marlene Voss. The man was her brother-in-law, Dale. The boy was her grandson, Theo, whose mother, Marlene's daughter, had not made it out of the house. Marlene didn't explain what that meant, and I didn't ask, because Dale's grip on the tire iron tightened every time the subject orbited near it. And I understood that some facts are communicated through the body. They got in the truck. I drove south, away from my daughter, because north no longer existed as a direction that led anywhere, and because Marlene said she knew a place underground, a place she'd seen once, 20 years ago, that wouldn't be on any map. I believed her because I had nothing else to believe. Marlene directed me off the blacktop onto a succession of increasingly degraded roads, first a paved county route with crumbling shoulders, then a gravel Forest Service track, Then something that barely qualified as a path. Two tire ruts separated by a spine of weeds that scraped the truck's undercarriage. We climbed steadily, switchbacking up the eastern slope of a ridge I could identify on my cached maps as part of the Gauley Mountain complex, though the specific road we were on didn't appear in any layer I had. This bothered me professionally. It shouldn't have mattered. Professionalism was an artifact of a world that had stopped existing, but the cartographer in me kept reaching for the framework. Unmapped roads meant either recent construction or deliberate omission, and this road was clearly neither recent nor accidental. The gravel base was decades old, compressed and weathered into a surface that felt almost geological. Someone had built this road a long time ago, and then made sure it didn't appear in any official record. Dale hadn't spoken since we got in the truck. He sat in the back seat with Theo on his lap, staring out the window at the passing timber with the 1,000-yard gaze of a man whose operating system had crashed and not yet rebooted. Theo was asleep, or appeared to be his small fingers curled into the fabric of Dale's flannel shirt. "You need to tell me where we're going," I said to Marlene. "I'm telling you. I'm pointing." "That's not telling. That's directing." She looked at me sideways. "You're a particular kind of person, aren't you?" "Directing." She looked at me sideways. "You're a particular kind of person, aren't you?" "Directing." She looked at me sideways. "You're a particular kind of person, aren't you?" "Directing." She looked at me sideways. "You're a particular kind of person, aren't you?" I map things. Knowing where I am is not a personality quirk. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something more measured, as though she were deciding how much truth the moment could bear. "My late husband, Virgil, worked for the Army Corps of Engineers in the 60s and 70s. Survey and construction support, mostly dam-related. But there was a period, maybe 3 years, where he was assigned to something he wouldn't talk about. Domestic continuity projects, he called it once. Hardened infrastructure for government survival in the event of nuclear exchange. He said most of it was in Virginia and Pennsylvania, but there was at least one site in West Virginia that got built and then abandoned before it was ever finished. Sealed, struck from the records. And he showed you. He showed me the entrance. Once. We were hiking before Dale's brother was born. Virgil pointed at a hillside and said, "There's a door in there that opens into a room bigger than our house, and nobody alive remembers it but me." Then he kept walking and never mentioned it again. "And you remember where it was?" "I remember the ridge. I remember the creek. I remember the shape of the rock face. Whether the door is still there, whether it opens, whether anything behind it is usable, I have no idea. But it's the only direction that isn't towards something that wants to kill us." I kept driving. The road narrowed further, branches scraping both sides of the truck, and then it ended abruptly at a small clearing where a rusted cable gate hung between two concrete posts. Beyond it, the forest closed in completely. We got out. The air was different at this elevation, cooler, thinner, carrying the mineral smell of exposed limestone. Marlene stood at the edge of the clearing and turned slowly, orienting herself against landmarks I couldn't read. Dale set Theo down, and the boy stood wobbling, looking around with the bewildered patience of a child who has learned in the space of a single day that adults cannot be relied upon to explain anything. "This way," Marlene said, and walked into the trees. We followed her along the remnants of a footpath for maybe 400 yards, descending slightly, until we reached a creek bed running along the base of a limestone bluff. The bluff rose 40 feet, stained with mineral streaks, furred with moss. Marlene walked along its base, one hand trailing the rock, and stopped. "Here," she said. I saw nothing but stone. "Help me clear this," she said, and began pulling at a mat of dead vegetation clinging to a shallow recess in the rock face. It took 20 minutes to clear the growth. Underneath was a steel door set into a concrete frame that had been poured directly into the limestone. The door was maybe 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, painted in a green that had oxidized to a chalky gray, with no visible handle, just a recessed wheel lock of the type you'd find on a submarine hatch. The concrete frame was cracked in places, but structurally intact, and the surrounding rock had been cut with precision that spoke of heavy equipment and military engineering budgets. Dale tried the wheel first. Budgets. Dale tried the wheel first. It didn't move. He tried again, putting his considerable weight behind it, and the metal groaned but held. I found a length of dead hardwood on the ground, wedged it through the wheel's spokes as a lever, and together we leaned into it. The wheel broke free with a sound like a gunshot, corroded metal surrendering all at once, and rotated 3 full turns before the locking bars retracted with a deep, resonant thud that I felt through the soles of my boots. The door swung inward on hinges that screamed. Behind it was darkness and a smell that was surprisingly clean, dry stone. Stale air, a faint chemical tang that might have been preservative coating on metal surfaces. Marlene produced a flashlight from her jacket pocket, and the beam cut into a corridor of poured concrete, maybe 8 feet wide, extending straight into the mountain for as far as the light reached. Virgil wasn't exaggerating, Dale said. It was the first sentence he'd spoken in over an hour. We entered. I propped the door open with a rock because the idea of it closing behind us activated a claustrophobia I hadn't known I possessed. The corridor ran roughly 50 feet before opening into a wider space, a junction room, with 3 branching passages and a ceiling high enough to accommodate the industrial light fixtures that hung from conduit runs, dead and cobwebbed but intact. The floor was smooth concrete, dry, with a faint layer of calcium dust that recorded our footprints in clean impressions. Marlene swept the flashlight across the walls, stenciled markings in faded yellow paint, directional arrows, alphanumeric codes, a radiation trefoil symbol that confirmed the Cold War origin. One passage was labeled Mech/Util. Another read HAB-A. The third said C&C, which I assumed meant command and control. "We need to check the mechanical room first," I said, falling without thinking into the framework of building assessment that had governed my professional life. Structural integrity, then utilities, then habitability. The sequence was automatic. Dale looked at me. "You know about this kind of thing?" "I know about buildings. This is a building inside a mountain. The principles are the same." They weren't, of course, not entirely. But the lie gave me a purpose, and purpose was the only thing keeping the image of Cass's face from flooding every channel of my consciousness. I had a daughter in a city that a stranger had described as gone, and I was standing in a hole in the ground, cataloging stenciled markings, because the alternative was to sit down on the cold concrete and come apart. The mechanical room was a revelation. 2 diesel generators, industrial grade, bolted to isolation pads on the floor. A wall-mounted electrical panel with breakers labeled in the same stenciled code. A bank of sealed batteries that were certainly dead after decades of neglect. And, most importantly, a ventilation system with intake and exhaust shafts that ran up through the rock to the surface, fitted with manual dampers and what appeared to be the remains of chemical-biological filtration units. The filters were long degraded, but the ductwork was intact, which meant airflow was possible even without power. The mountain was breathing on its own through these shafts, a slow, passive exchange that had kept the interior dry and prevented the total stagnation that would have made the space uninhabitable. I began taking inventory in my head, then stopped and took it on paper instead, pulling a field notebook from my vest pocket. Old habits. Map the space. Label the systems. Know what you have before you decide what you need. Behind me, Theo began to cry, and the sound echoed through the concrete corridors like something ancient learning to speak. We spent the first 2 hours in a kind of mechanical trance, moving through the bunker's 3 main corridors with Marlene's flashlight and a headlamp I'd retrieved from the truck. The facility was larger than I'd expected, not the vast subterranean complex of Cold War mythology, but a genuine hardened shelter designed to sustain perhaps 40 to 50 people for an extended period. HAB-A contained 2 dormitory rooms with metal bunk frames, no mattresses. But the frames were solid, a communal bathroom with non-functional plumbing, and a kitchen space with stainless steel counters and cabinet systems still bolted to the walls. The C&C section held a communications room with banks of dead radio equipment, a small office, and a situation room with a wall-mounted map of the region that predated the interstate system. It was that map that broke something in me. I stood in front of it with my headlamp illuminating a cartographic snapshot of a world that had existed before I was born. County boundaries hand-drawn, towns labeled with populations that had since halved or vanished. And I thought, I have spent my career updating the version of reality that this map represents, and none of it matters now. Every digital layer I'd ever created, every GPS-corrected parcel boundary, every LiDAR elevation model, all of it was inaccessible, server-dependent, and as dead as the radio equipment on the shelves beside me. This paper map on the wall, drawn by hand with India ink and a steady wrist, was now more useful than anything I had ever produced. Dale found the water. A cistern system fed by a natural spring that penetrated the limestone above the facility, channeled through copper pipes into a holding tank in the mechanical room. The tank was full. The water, when we tested it cautiously, tasted of mineral and cold stone, and appeared clean. Virgil Voss, or whoever had designed this place, had anchored its most critical system to geology rather than machinery. And the mountain had kept its promise for 6 decades, without maintenance. We brought the supplies from the truck, a cooler with food that would last 2 days, bottled water we no longer needed, my field kit, Wadin, Dale's tire iron, a box of Theo's diapers and clothing that Marlene had packed with the focused efficiency of a woman who had rehearsed emergency departure in her mind long before it became necessary. It was Marlene who said what I was avoiding. You need to close that door. I was standing at the junction room, and I could feel the outside air moving through the corridor from the propped open entrance, carrying the green smell of the forest, and beneath it, something else, something faintly sweet and wrong that I hadn't noticed when we'd arrived, but that had been growing as the afternoon warmed. If I close it, I can't get to Beckley. You can't get to Beckley now. I can try. Marlene sat down on an upturned crate and pulled Theo onto her lap. The boy had stopped crying and entered a state of watchful stillness that seemed too composed for his age. Joel, I watched my daughter die this morning. She was bitten at 4 a.m., and by 7, she was something else. And Dale had to... She stopped, drew a breath that carried the full weight of a sentence she would never finish. I am telling you that Beckley is not a place your daughter is anymore. She's either out or she's not. And if she's out, she's moving away from it, not sitting in it waiting for you. You don't know that. I know what Beckley looked like when we left, and I know what you'll become if you drive back into it. You'll become a body on a road that your daughter might one day have to walk past. The logic was merciless, and Marlene delivered it without cruelty. She was not a gentle woman, I was learning. She was a precise one. She located the truth and presented it without cushioning, the way a surgeon presents a scan. I walked to the entrance. The forest outside was golden with late afternoon light, indifferent to everything that had changed. I pulled the rock from the doorframe. The steel door swung shut with a finality that compressed the air in the corridor, and I sealed the wheel lock. The sound of the outside world disappeared. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the C&C room with my headlamp aimed at the wall map, tracing routes with my finger like a man reading scripture. Every road from our position to Beckley crossed terrain. I knew hollows and ridges and creek crossings I'd mapped in digital precision, and every one of them was now a corridor of unknown threat density. The cartographic part of my brain kept trying to solve the problem as though it were a land-use dispute, overlaying layers of risk and access, searching for the clean geometry that would connect my location to my daughter's. There was no clean geometry. There was just distance and darkness, and the thing I'd heard dragging itself through mud at the trailhead that morning. Around midnight, I heard Dale moving in the dormitory corridor. He appeared in the doorway, tire iron still in hand. He hadn't put it down once since we'd arrived, and stood there for a moment before sitting in the swivel chair opposite mine. It protested under his weight with a squeal that cut through the underground silence. "I killed my brother's wife," he said. I looked at him. His face was half lit by the ambient glow of my headlamp bouncing off the wall map, and the shadows transformed his ordinary features into something carved and old. Marlene's daughter, Virgil Jr.'s wife. She turned, and Marlene was holding Theo, and I. He lifted the tire iron slightly, then set it across his knees. She was still wearing her bathrobe, pink bathrobe with flowers on it. She'd been making coffee when the neighbor came through the back door. "Where's Virgil Jr.? "National Guard. Deployed to Charleston Monday. We haven't heard from him since Tuesday night." "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be useful." He said it without hostility, more like a man setting terms. "Marlene says you know buildings, so figure this building out. Tell us what works and what doesn't. Tell us how long we can stay." "I'm a cartographer, Dale. I map property lines. I don't engineer shelters." "You're what we've got." He left. I sat with that sentence for a long time, because it contained a truth that I recognized from the inside. The truth of being appointed to a role you haven't earned through any mechanism you can contest. Dale hadn't asked me to lead. He'd asked me to be functional. The distinction mattered. Leadership implies authority. Functionality implies obligation. You can refuse to lead. You can't refuse to function without becoming something the group has to carry. I spent the rest of the night inventorying the mechanical room by headlamp. The generators were diesel, and the fuel tanks were dry. Whatever had been stored decades ago had either evaporated or been drained. But the ventilation dampers were operable, and by adjusting them manually, I could control airflow through the facility without power. The spring-fed cistern was gravity-pressured, which meant water would flow to the lower fixtures without pumping. The bathroom plumbing was connected to a septic system that I couldn't inspect without excavation. But this main drain line had a clean-out cap that opened without resistance, suggesting the line wasn't fully collapsed. By dawn, which I registered only as a faint change in the air pressure near the intake vents, I had a list. What worked? Structure, water, airflow, physical security. What didn't? Power, heating, cooking capability, communications, sanitation beyond basic gravity drainage. What I didn't know, everything about the outside. I found Marlene awake in the kitchen, boiling water from the cistern on a camp stove she'd produced from somewhere in her collection of emergency supplies. Theo was asleep on a blanket on the counter. She handed me a cup, and I drank without asking what was in it. It was hot, and that was enough. "Can we survive here?" she asked. "For a while. Weeks, maybe, with what we have. But we'll need food, fuel, and eventually we'll need to open that door. Then we open it when we're ready, not before." Agreed. Outside, something we could not see was remaking the world. Inside, we drank our hot water and pretended that agreement was the same thing as control. On the third day, someone knocked. Not the way a person knocks with knuckles, in rhythm, with the social expectation of a response. This was a flat, irregular percussion against the steel door, a sound without pattern or purpose, like a branch falling against a wall in wind. Except there was no wind underground, and branches don't find their way 50 feet down a concrete corridor to knock on sealed hatches. Dale and I stood at the junction room, listening. Marlene had taken Theo into the furthest dormitory and closed the interior fire door, which was the closest thing to a second line of defense the facility offered. The knocking continued for perhaps 4 minutes, then stopped. Then started again, this time lower on the door, as though whatever was making the sound had shifted position or collapsed and was now striking from a seated or prone posture. "It followed us," Dale said. "It didn't follow us. It found the corridor. The entrance is in a rock face with a cleared area in front of it. We left tracks in the vegetation. It wandered in. You're making a distinction that doesn't matter." He was right, and I knew he was right. But making distinctions that didn't matter was the closest thing I had to a coping mechanism. I had been mapping the interior of the bunker on graph paper for 3 days, measuring corridors by stride length, sketching room dimensions, annotating systems, creating a document that no one had asked for and no one would ever file. The act of translating physical space into two-dimensional representation kept my hands busy, and my mind within the walls of a framework that preceded the collapse. As long as I was mapping, I was still a cartographer, not a man trapped underground with strangers while his daughter existed in an unknown state in a city he couldn't reach. The knocking stopped. We waited an hour before I approached the door and pressed my ear against the cold steel. Nothing. I could feel the faintest vibration ambient, probably whined over the external rock face being transmitted through the frame, but no deliberate sound. "We need to establish a protocol," I said when I returned to the junction room. "For the door. For when we open it." "We don't open it," Dale said. "We open it eventually. We have food for maybe 4 more days. The cistern gives us water, but calories are finite. We need to forage, hunt, or scavenge, and all of those require the surface. Then we open it when we have to, and not 1 minute before." This became the first real tension between us, not a fight, but a philosophical divergence that would define the weeks to come. Dale's instinct was fortress. Seal, defend, wait. Mine was cartographic, survey, assess, move through. He saw the door as a shield. I saw it as a bottleneck. We were both correct, which meant we were both inadequate. It was Marlene who broke the deadlock, as she would break every deadlock that followed, with a practicality that transcended both our positions. "We open it tomorrow morning. 2 people go out. 1 stays with Theo. We take the truck if it still starts. We drive to the nearest intact structure. We take what we can carry, and we come back. 30 minutes maximum on the surface. That's not a debate. That's a schedule. Dale looked at her. She looked back. Whatever passed between them was a communication that predated the crisis, the established hierarchy of a family in which Marlene occupied a position of authority that Dale had long ago accepted, not through submission, but through recognition that she was, in most situations, simply correct. 30 minutes, Dale said. I spent the rest of that evening doing something I hadn't done since graduate school. Drawing a map from memory, not a GIS layer or a georeferenced survey. A hand-drawn, estimated, deliberately imprecise sketch of the surrounding terrain based on what I'd seen during our drive-in and what I could recall from the cached county data. Roads, creeks, elevation changes, the approximate locations of structures I'd noted on the way up. My hand was steady. The map was crude, but it was mine. And it was made of knowledge no one else in that bunker possessed. Marlene and I went out. Dale stayed with Theo, stationed at the inner fire door with his tire iron and a length of rebar we'd found in the mechanical room, looking like a medieval sentry guarding a castle of damp concrete and dead wiring. The morning was overcast, cool, the forest utterly still in a way that registered as wrong before I could articulate why. Then I understood. No birds. The ridge should have been alive with them at that hour. Warblers, thrushes, the omnipresent crows that populated every hollow in the state. Instead, the canopy was silent, and the silence had a physical quality, a pressure against the eardrums that made every sound we produced. Footsteps on leaf litter, the creak of the truck door, obscenely loud. The truck started on the second attempt. We drove down the mountain on the path we'd come up, and the first thing I noticed was that our tracks from 3 days ago had been disturbed. Something had walked the road since we'd driven it. The tire ruts bore overlapping footprints, human in shape but irregular in spacing. The stride length varying wildly as though the walker's legs were not fully under conscious control. Some prints were deep, suggesting stumbling weight transfer. Others were smeared, as though the foot had been dragged rather than lifted. "How many?" Marlene asked, reading the road with a facility that surprised me. "Hard to say. At least 2. Maybe more if some tracks have been overwritten." We reached the county blacktop and turned east toward what my memory map marked as a cluster of structures, a few houses, a small church, possibly a general store about 3 miles along the road. The drive took 5 minutes and felt like 30. The cluster was 4 buildings, 2 houses, a church, and a structure that turned out to be a volunteer fire department. One house was burned, the char still faintly warm. The other was intact but open front door hanging from one hinge. Interior ransacked by someone or something with no interest in organization. We cleared it room by room, Marlene holding a hatchet she'd brought from the truck's toolbox, me carrying the tire iron Dale had reluctantly loaned. No infected inside. But the kitchen told a story. Cabinets open, shelves stripped of canned goods, a toppled chair, a smear of dried blood on the linoleum that tracked in a straight line toward the back door. Whoever lived here had packed and fled, or had been packed and taken, or had joined the bleeding procession that was rewriting the region's population into 2 categories: absent and altered. The fire department was the real find. Its supply closet contained cases of bottled water, a first aid kit of professional grade, protein bars and bulk packaging with a sell-by date 2 years out, and critically, a hand-crank emergency radio that, when I turned the handle, produced a red LED and a burst of static that was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in 3 days. Marlene found blankets in the church, stacked in a closet that smelled of mothballs and communion wine. We loaded everything into the truck bed and covered it with a tarp. Total time on the surface, 22 minutes. We were 8 minutes under Marlene's limit, and I felt the surplus as a physical relief, a small account of safety we deposited against future withdrawals. On the drive back, we saw the first one clearly. It was standing in the road, about 200 yards ahead, facing away from us, swaying with the metronome indecision of a figure that had somewhere to go, but had forgotten the concept of destination. It was male, wearing what had been a work uniform, coveralls, boots. And its posture was wrong in a way that my body understood before my eyes could catalog the specifics. The shoulders were hunched forward. The head hung at an angle that suggested the muscles of the neck were operating unevenly. One arm hung motionless, while the other performed a slow, repetitive grasping motion, opening and closing on empty air. I stopped the truck. Marlene put her hand on my arm. "Go around," she said. "Don't stop, don't look." I went around. I looked. The face was not something I will describe, because some knowledge, once shared, becomes a weight the listener carries without benefit. We drove back up the mountain in silence. The hand-crank radio changed the interior climate of the bunker more than the supplies did. Protein bars extended our survival timeline, but information extended our psychological capacity to use it. That evening, the four of us, 3 adults, and 1 eerily quiet toddler gathered in the C&C room while I turned the crank, and Marlene scanned frequencies with the patience of a woman who had grown up in an era when finding a station required effort. She found 3 signals. The first was an automated FEMA loop, digitized and impersonal, repeating instructions to shelter in place and await military coordination. The second was a ham radio operator somewhere in Virginia, broadcasting intermittently with updates that were mostly geographic: which towns were dark, which roads were impassable, which rivers had become natural barriers. The third was a woman in Kentucky, very close to our frequency, who was sobbing and calling for someone named David, and who went silent while we listened and did not come back. The ham operator provided the first structural picture of the crisis beyond our immediate experience. The infection had spread along population corridors, interstates, urban centers, river valleys, and was now propagating into rural areas through the movement of fleeing survivors who carried bites they hadn't yet recognized or acknowledged. The pattern was centrifugal. Outward from cities, following roads, pooling in low-lying areas where geography funneled movement. Mountains were slower to fall, he said, because elevation created natural friction. Fewer roads in, steeper terrain, lower population density. But slower was not immune. And he'd watched his own ridge community in the Shenandoah go dark over 3 days. He said the military had established a containment line along the Appalachian spine from Pennsylvania to northern Georgia. But it was porous and thinning. He said there were refugee collection points, but he didn't know which ones were still operational. He said the infected appeared to avoid water, some not fear it, but failed to navigate it, as though the motor planning required to cross a stream exceeded their deteriorating cognitive capacity. This was the first tactical intelligence we received, and I filed it beside the creek that ran past our bunker entrance, with the grim satisfaction of a man adding a defensive feature to a map. Dale listened to all of this without expression. Then he said, "Ask him how long." I keyed the radio. "This is a small group in southern West Virginia. Can you estimate duration? How long before this burns out?" The response took a moment. "Nobody knows. Military's not saying. CDC went dark Tuesday. Some people think weeks, some think months. I think the answer is longer than the food lasts." He paused. "Sorry, that's not helpful." It was, though. Unhelpful truths are the foundation of useful planning, because they eliminate the fantasy timelines that lead to irrational resource allocation. If we assumed months, we had to build systems. If we assumed weeks, we could ration. The gap between those two assumptions was the gap between surviving and merely persisting. That night, I began drawing a different kind of map. Not the interior survey of the bunker or the memory sketch of surrounding terrain, but a resource map, an overlay of what we had, what we needed, and where we might find it. I marked the fire department and the church cluster as cleared. I marked the burned house as lost. I estimated other potential scavenging targets based on my recollection of the county GIS data. A campground to the south, a forestry maintenance station on the next ridge, a small cluster of vacation cabins near a reservoir I'd surveyed 2 years earlier. Marlene watched me work. After a while, she said, "You're calmer when you're drawing." Drawing is thinking, for me. My husband was the same way. Couldn't process anything unless he had a pencil and a flat surface. She paused. He'd have liked this bunker. He'd have walked every inch of it with his hands behind his back, humming. What happened to him? Lung cancer. 6 years ago. He smoked like a power plant and died like a gentleman. Said thank you to the hospice nurse and closed his eyes. The intimacy of that detail, offered without invitation, settled into the room like warmth from a stove. On the 9th day, we found people. Or rather, they found us. Marlene and I were on our 3rd surface run, this time to the forestry maintenance station 2 ridges east, which my map predicted would contain tools, fuel, and possibly a functioning vehicle when we came around a switchback and nearly drove into a makeshift roadblock constructed from fallen trees and a stripped pickup truck. 2 figures emerged from the tree line with weapons raised. One carried a hunting rifle. The other held a compound bow at full draw. Both were young early 20s, and both had the hollowed, electric look of people running on adrenaline and cortisol, with the higher reasoning centers increasingly offline. I stopped the truck and put my hands on the dashboard. Marlene did the same. The rifle holder approached a woman, tall with dark hair pulled back under a baseball cap, wearing a fleece jacket torn at one sleeve. She circled to my window and looked in with eyes that conducted a complete threat assessment in about 2 seconds. How many in the vehicle? 2, just us. Where are you coming from? Up the mountain. Up the mountain where? I hesitated. This was the moment that every interaction going forward would contain the instant where honesty about the bunker's existence became a potential threat to its security. If these 2 were desperate enough to build a roadblock, they were desperate enough to take a shelter by force, and our defensive capability was a tire iron and a hatchet. Marlene answered before I could construct a lie. "We have a place, underground. We're looking for supplies. Where are you from?" The woman lowered the rifle an inch. Not all the way down. "Ansted. What's left of it?" "How many of you?" 8. Started as 14. She said this with the clipped efficiency of someone who has already grieved in bulk and can't afford retail. "We've been moving for 5 days, staying ahead of them, barely." The man with the bow, who turned out to be her brother, a quiet person named Ethan, who spoke mainly in monosyllables and had the accuracy of an experienced deer hunter, lowered his weapon when Marlene stepped out of the truck. There is something about Marlene's physical presence that communicates trustworthiness through posture alone. She stands the way competent people stand, balanced, open-handed, making eye contact without aggression. In every encounter that followed, she was the one who stepped out first, and she was the reason we survived those encounters. The woman's name was Noor Hassani. She was a veterinary technician from Ansted, and the group she'd assembled behind the roadblock included her brother Ethan, an elderly couple named Frank and Doris Webb. a teenager named Skylar who hadn't spoken in 3 days, and 3 others whose names I'd learn later. A long-haul trucker called Mac, a woman named Patricia who clutched a photograph she never showed anyone, and a man named Kendrick who'd been a volunteer firefighter and was the only one besides Noor who seemed capable of sustained, rational decision-making. 8 people. Our bunker had been built for 50, but was currently supporting 4 on systems I'd jury-rigged, with limited tools and no power. 8 more would triple our water consumption, overwhelm our sanitation capacity, and reduce our food timeline from precarious to critical. Marlene looked at me. I looked at the 8 faces behind the roadblock, exhausted, filthy, frightened, alive, and felt the mathematics of survival collide with the geometry of conscience. I could draw lines around resources and calculate exactly how much each additional person cost in calories, water, and air. I could map the precise point at which the bunker's carrying capacity would be exceeded. And none of those numbers answered the only question that mattered, which was not, can we sustain them, but can we close the truck door and drive away while they stand here watching? "Follow us," I said. "Stay close. Don't fall behind." Marlene closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she was already climbing back into the truck, calculating the revised logistics in silence. 12 people in a bunker built for 50 should have been manageable. The math suggested surplus capacity. The reality revealed that Cold War planners had designed for a staffed, provisioned, powered facility, not a dead shell being hand-operated by civilians with a camp stove and a creek. Every system I'd stabilized for 4 now groaned under 12. Water was the first crisis. The spring-fed cistern recharged slowly, and 12 people drinking, cooking, and performing basic hygiene exceeded the inflow rate within 2 days. I calculated the deficit on graph paper, showed it to Marlene and Noor, who had rapidly established herself as the operational leader of the new arrivals, and proposed a rationing schedule that allocated water by function rather than equality, more for the elderly Webbs, who were at higher dehydration risk, less for the able-bodied, with cooking water recycled through a filtration improvisation that Kendrick constructed from gravel, sand, and charcoal in a 5-gallon bucket. Sanitation was the second crisis. The gravity drain I'd tested for 4 was not engineered for 12. And within the first week of full occupancy, the smell in the lower corridors became a physical presence that affected sleep, morale, and eventually health. Frank Webb developed a respiratory irritation that Noor, drawing on her veterinary training in a way that was medically imperfect but functionally adequate, treated with positioning and hydration. We designated a single bathroom for use and sealed the others, establishing an exterior latrine during surface runs that required a security perimeter and added risk to every trip above ground. But the real crisis was spatial. 12 people in concrete corridors with no natural light, no privacy, and no ability to leave creates a psychological compression that I had not anticipated and was not equipped to manage. The bunker's dormitory rooms were adequate for sleeping, but offered no separation during waking hours. Conversations were communal by default. Tensions had no room to dissipate. Every irritation, Dale's habit of tapping the tire iron against his thigh, Skylar's unbroken silence that some found eerie, Mac's tendency to narrate his actions in a low mumble, became amplified by proximity into provocations that required conscious restraint to absorb. I dealt with this the only way I knew how. I mapped it. I drew a floor plan of the bunker and designated zone sleeping areas, common space, a quiet zone in the C&C room, a work area in the mechanical room, and posted it on the wall of the junction room with handwritten labels. It was absurd. It was a zoning ordinance for a cave. But people followed it, because humans are territorial animals who function better when boundaries are visible. And my entire career had been the art of making invisible boundaries visible. Nor approached me on the third evening after the merger. We were in the mechanical room, where I was adjusting the ventilation dampers for the increased CO2 load, a task that required checking the calcium hydroxide deposits on the vent grates as a crude indicator of air quality. "You're not an engineer," she said. "Not accusatory, diagnostic." "No. You're a map maker, cartographer, county planning office. So, everything you've done here, the water calculations, the airflow, the sanitation, you're improvising." Aggressively. She studied me with the evaluative focus of someone accustomed to assessing patients who couldn't describe their own symptoms. "Okay. Then here's what I need you to know. Frank Webb has a heart condition he's not disclosing. Patricia is holding a photograph of a child she lost in Ansted, and she hasn't slept more than an hour at a stretch since we left. Skylar is nonverbal not because of trauma, but because of pre-existing selective mutism. And forcing him to speak will make it worse. And Mac is drinking from a flask he thinks no one knows about, which means our alcohol supply is being consumed by one person, while the rest of us could use it for wound disinfection." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the one drawing the maps. You're the one people look at when they want to know where to go. So you need to know who you're routing around." She was right. The map I was drawing had just become human, and human terrain doesn't hold still. The surface runs became the skeleton of our existence, the structure on which every other activity hung. We established a rotation. 2 people out, always, with a maximum window of 45 minutes that Marlene had expanded from 30 once the scavenging radius required longer drives. Teams were paired for complementary skills, Nor and me for assessment and medical triage of found supplies, Marlene and Kendrick for heavy lifting and security, Dale and Ethan for hunting and overwatch. The others stayed below. Frank and Doris managed interior operations with the quiet efficiency of people who had run a household for 40 years and could organize a pantry into their sleep. Patricia kept herself useful through ceaseless cleaning that served double duty as sanitation maintenance and personal coping mechanism. Skylar, once someone put a pencil in his hand, turned out to be a meticulous inventory tracker who maintained our supply ledger in handwriting so precise it looked typeset. Mac fixed things: the camp stove, a collapsed bunk frame, a jammed damper handle with the mechanical intuition of a man who'd kept a truck running across 30 states. On runs, we mapped the infection's presence through signs rather than contact. We learned to read the landscape the way trackers read game trails: broken vegetation, abandoned vehicles, discarded belongings, the dark stains on pavement that told a story in a language we became fluent in against our will. The infected were present in the valleys, but sparse on the ridges, consistent with the ham operator's observation about elevation and motor planning. They moved downhill reliably. Uphill movement was rare, uncoordinated, and seemed to exhaust them rapidly, leaving them stalled on slopes in postures of mechanical failure, frozen mid-stride, tilted, occasionally toppled, and unable to right themselves. This gave us a tactical geometry I could actually work with. Our bunker sat at roughly 2,400 feet on a ridge with no gentle approach from any direction. The access road climbed 600 vertical feet in under 2 miles, with gradients that challenged a 4-wheel drive truck. For infected with degraded motor function, it was a nearly impassable barrier. I drew the topographic contour lines around our position and shaded the area above 2,000 feet in green. Our safety margin, defined not by walls, but by gravity and the mountain's indifference. But people were not topology. Survivors moved uphill because survivors could think, and thinking people seek high ground for the same reasons military strategists have for millennia. In our 4th week, a family of 3 appeared at the bunker entrance, a couple and their 8-year-old daughter, exhausted, carrying a single backpack and a gallon jug of water. They'd seen our tire tracks on the access road and followed them up. I was on interior watch when the knock came, a real knock this time. Human in rhythm, desperate in force. I opened the door and found a man on the edge of collapse, his daughter behind him, his wife leaning against the rock face with one hand pressed to her side in a way that my body recognized before my brain did. "She's bitten," the man said, "3 days ago. But she's fine. She's still herself. Please." His wife's name was Grace. Her husband was Tom. Their daughter was Lily. Grace's wound was on her left flank, below the ribs, wrapped in a bandage that was stained but not fresh. She was lucid, oriented, and looked at me with full human awareness when I examined the dressing with Noor's help. "3 days?" Noor asked. "3 days," Tom confirmed. "Everyone we've seen turns within hours. She hasn't. I don't know why." Noor looked at me. I looked at Marlene, who had come up the corridor and was standing behind me with an expression that contained every variable of the decision we were about to make. A bitten woman, lucid after 3 days, inside our sealed refuge. I let them in because Grace looked at her daughter the way Cass used to look at me when I picked her up from school, with the uncomplicated trust that the person in front of her would not let the world do its worst. We were now 15. The bunker groaned. Grace didn't turn. Not on day 4, not on day 5, not on day 7. Noor monitored her with the tools available: a thermometer from the first aid kit, manual pulse checks, pupil response with a flashlight, hourly cognitive assessments that consisted of conversation and observation. Grace's wound was healing. Her temperature was normal. Her cognition was intact, sharp even, and she became one of the more articulate voices in the group's evening discussions, offering observations about the infection's behavior that drew on her background as a high school biology teacher. The group's response to her presence split along a fault line I hadn't anticipated. Dale, Mac, and Frank wanted her quarantined, physically separated behind a sealed door, monitored at distance, treated as a potential threat until enough time had passed to confirm safety. Marlene, Noor, Kendrick, and Tom wanted her integrated, kept close, watched carefully, but allowed the dignity of communal living. The others didn't voice opinions, which in a confined group is itself a position. Broadcasting discomfort without assuming responsibility for it. I was asked to decide. Not because I had authority, no one had conferred any, but because I was the one whose map was on the wall, whose zoning plan governed daily movement, whose voice had become, through the quiet accumulation of functional decisions, the voice people waited for before acting. I had become the person who drew the lines, and now they wanted me to draw one around Grace. I drew it wrong, and I knew it was wrong while I was drawing it. I designated a section of the HAB-A corridor as a monitored zone, not locked, not sealed, but marked. Grace could move freely within it, and others could enter, but the line existed on the map, and therefore existed in people's minds. It was a compromise that satisfied no one and stigmatized Grace while pretending to respect her autonomy. Tom saw through it immediately and told me so, quietly, outside the dormitory. "You just drew a border around my wife. It's a precaution. It's a cage with an open door. The open door doesn't change what it is." He was right. But Noor was also right when she pulled me aside an hour later and said, "If Grace turns in the middle of the night in a room full of sleeping people, Every death is on the person who didn't separate her. And Dale was right when he said nothing, and simply moved his bunk to the far end of the dormitory, placing maximum distance between himself and the marked zone, with the wordless pragmatism of a man who trusted his instincts over anyone's ethics. Grace resolved it herself. On the 8th day after her arrival, she came to me in the C&C room, sat down across from the wall map, and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen as a map maker, not as a person." I waited. I was bitten. I'm not turning. That means either I'm immune or the infection doesn't work the way we think it does. Either way, I'm the most important data point in this bunker, and you're wasting it by drawing lines around me. What do you want me to do? I want to go back outside, with Noor, to the place where I was bitten, a gas station off Route 60 near Hiko. There were others there who were bitten and didn't turn, at least 2. I saw them 3 days into it, still human, still aware. If immunity exists, it's not just me, and understanding why could change everything about how we operate. That's a 30-mile round trip through hostile terrain. And I'm the only person in this bunker who's been bitten and survived. That makes me the only one who can walk among them and potentially walk back. The logic was either brilliant or suicidal. I couldn't tell which. And the distinction depended on a biological variable I had no way to measure. What I could measure was the route 30 miles of valley roads, creek crossings, and small town remnants that I'd been mapping in expanding detail with every surface run. I pulled out my hand-drawn regional map and spread it on the table. "Show me where," I said. Noor vetoed the plan. Not the concept, she was intellectually ravenous for any data on immunity, but the execution. I'm not driving 30 miles to a gas station on the word of a woman whose survival mechanism I don't understand, with infected density increasing the further we descend from this ridge. If Grace is immune, we study her here. Blood, saliva, wound characteristics, behavioral observation. We build the data set with what we have. It was the first time Noor and I disagreed operationally, and the disagreement revealed something about the difference between us that I hadn't fully appreciated. Noor was a clinician. She wanted controlled conditions, repeatable observations, conclusions supported by evidence gathered in safety. I was a cartographer. I wanted to expand the map to push the boundary of known territory outward until the shape of the problem became visible. She worked inward. I worked outward. Both instincts were correct. Neither was sufficient. We compromised. Grace would remain in the bunker as a subject of ongoing observation. But our surface runs would begin to include reconnaissance beyond the immediate scavenging radius, specifically targeting locations where survivors might be gathered and where additional immunity data might exist. I expanded my hand-drawn map to include the full county, then the adjacent counties, building a layered document that now covered an entire wall of the C&C room, and had become the closest thing we had to a shared consciousness. People gathered at the map the way earlier generations gathered at a hearth. Evenings in the bunker had developed a rhythm: chores, meal preparation, the brief window of radio scanning, and then the map session, where anyone with surface observations would report and I would update the document in real time. Ethan's hunting routes revealed game trail patterns that indicated where infected were not present. Kendrick's scouting identified intact structures we hadn't yet reached. Marlene's memory of pre-crisis geography filled in details. No digital database could have provided the location of root cellars, springhouses, abandoned Orkding camps that might contain tools. The map became a living thing. And I realized one evening, standing before it with a pencil in my hand and 12 people watching, that I was no longer drawing the land. I was drawing the community's understanding of itself in relation to the land. Every annotation was a piece of collective intelligence. Every route was a decision we'd made together. Every X marking a cleared site was a small claim of sovereignty over terrain that the infection had tried to render meaningless. This was the moment, not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a man with a pencil noticing the change in what the pencil was doing, when I understood that I had stopped mapping property lines and started mapping something that mattered. Grace contributed to the map sessions with a biologist's eye. She noted patterns in infected behavior that the rest of us had observed but not systematized. Their apparent inability to climb grades above a certain steepness. Their tendency to cluster near water they couldn't cross. Their visible physical degradation. Over time, the ham operator's early intelligence about the pathogen's self-limiting nature was being confirmed by our own observations. Infected we'd seen in the first week were moving more slowly in the third. Some had stopped moving entirely, standing in fields or road shoulders in postures of permanent arrest, like sculptures of the people they'd been. "They're degrading," Grace said during one session, tracing a line on the map between two observation points. Muscularly, neurologically. Whatever this pathogen does, it doesn't maintain the host. It burns through it. "How long?" Dale asked. It was the same question he'd pushed through the radio weeks earlier, and it carried the same weight. "I don't know. But the ones from the first wave are already failing. If the pattern holds, if each wave degrades on a similar timeline, then this has an endpoint, not because anyone stops it, but because the infrastructure of the threat is consuming itself." I marked her observation on the map with a notation I'd never used before in any professional context. A timeline estimate, speculative, drawn in pencil because pencil can be erased when reality corrects the assumption. The map now contained hope. I handled it carefully, the way you handle anything that might not survive examination. The arrival that broke us came without warning. On a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, a word I use loosely, since the days had lost their names, and we tracked time by supply cycles and surface run counts. I was adjusting the ventilation dampers when Ethan, who was on exterior watch at the bunker entrance, came down the corridor at a pace that communicated emergency without the need for words. "There's a group on the access road. Vehicles. At least 3, maybe 30 people." I went to the entrance and looked through the cracked door. They were halfway up the switchback, a mismatched convoy of a pickup truck, a minivan, and a school bus, with its roof rack loaded with supplies. The bus was laboring on the grade, engine whining, and the people visible through its windows were packed tight enough to fog the glass. 30 people. Our bunker was straining under 15. The math wasn't ambiguous. Noor was beside me. Marlene was behind her. Dale had materialized with his rebar. And Kendrick stood at the junction room entrance with a look on his face that I'd come to recognize as his particular expression of assessment, not hostile, not welcoming, just calculating how the next few minutes could cascade. "We can't take them," Dale said. "We're already past capacity." "We're past comfortable capacity," Noor corrected. "We're not past survival capacity." What's the difference? About 3 weeks of misery before the water runs out versus 3 weeks of discomfort before it doesn't. Marlene said nothing. She was watching the bus negotiate the switchback with the focused attention of someone reading a situation through its physical details, the speed of the vehicles, the condition of the tires, whether the driver was controlled or desperate. The convoy reached the clearing where our truck was parked. Doors opened. People emerged in the slow, stiff way of bodies that had been confined for hours. I counted. 26, including children. They were led by a man who stepped out of the pickup's driver's seat, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being in front assist, tall, organized in his movements, carrying a shotgun broken open over his forearm in the universal gesture of visible non-threat. He saw the bunker entrance and walked toward it. He saw me in the doorway and stopped at a distance that respected the threshold. "My name is Warren Cross," he said. "We're from Mount Hope. We've been driving for 2 days. We were told there was a shelter in these mountains." He paused, and in the pause I heard the sound of children coughing inside the bus. "We have people who need to be indoors." "Who told you about this place?" I asked. "A man on a ham radio. Said he'd been in contact with a group in the Gauley Mountain area that had found a government bunker. Said they were surviving." I felt the blood leave my face. The ham operator. Our ham operator. The one in Virginia. The one whose broadcasts we'd been receiving. And I now realized with a cold, falling sensation, occasionally responding to, confirming our location, our general situation, our existence. We had been so hungry for information that we'd become a signal ourselves, broadcasting our position to anyone with a receiver and a reason to move toward it. "We told him where we were," I said to Marlene. "You told him," Dale said, and the pronoun was precise and intentional. Warren Cross stood in the clearing with his 26 exhausted people and waited for an answer. Behind him, a woman was lifting a child down from the bus. A boy, maybe 5, who blinked in the mountain light as though emerging from a cave of his own. Theo, watching from behind Marlene's leg, stared at the boy with the first expression of recognition I'd seen on his face since we'd arrived. Another child. A mirror. Evidence that the category he belonged to had not been eliminated. I looked at the map in my head, the one I couldn't draw. The one that contained not contour lines and road networks, but the faces of every person who had found us. And the door I'd sealed, and the sound it had made closing. "Come inside," I said. And the map expanded beyond anything I knew how to hold. 41 people. The bunker became a compression chamber. I will not describe the first week of full occupation in detail, because the details are not instructive. They are merely the predictable consequences of tripling a population in a closed system without tripling any of the systems that support it. Water rationing dropped to survival minimums. The latrine situation became a health crisis that Nor addressed with the grim innovation of a field veterinarian managing a kenneled outbreak. Sleep became a rotation, with bunk space shared in shifts, and the corridors filled with people sitting against walls in the postures of waiting that I'd seen in photographs of refugee processing centers and never expected to inhabit. What was instructive was the social architecture that emerged, the map of human organization that no one drew but everyone navigated. Warren Cross, whose group had included a disproportionate number of families, became the de facto representative of what people had started calling the bus contingent, a designation that was geographic in origin but increasingly political in function. Our original 12, the Ridge Group, held institutional knowledge of the bunker's systems, and this knowledge conferred a power that was never formally acknowledged and never fully accepted. Nor and Warren clashed first. The issue was medical authority. Warren's group included a retired nurse named Helen, who challenged Nor's veterinary-derived protocols with the confidence of someone who had 40 years of human patient care and didn't intend to defer to an animal doctor. Nor responded with characteristic directness. "I've kept 15 people alive in a concrete hole for a month with a first aid kit and a thermometer. When you've done that, we'll discuss credentials." Helen didn't raise the issue again, but the fault line remained, visible in the way the two groups self-segregated during meals and the way conversations quieted when someone from one group entered a space occupied by the other. I tried to map this. Literally, I drew a social overlay on the bunker floor plan. marking where people consistently positioned themselves, which doorways functioned as boundaries, where the informal zones of territory had formed. It was the kind of analysis I'd done professionally for zoning disputes, translating human behavior into spatial patterns. And it revealed what I'd feared. The bunker was developing internal borders that, if they hardened, would produce the same dynamics that destroy any confined community, factional loyalty overriding collective survival. I showed the social map to Marlene. She studied it for a long time, then said, "Break the kitchen." What? The kitchen is the only space both groups use at the same time. It's the integration point. But right now, each group cooks separately and eats separately. Assign mixed cooking teams, force the overlap. People who prepare food together eat together. And people who eat together talk. And people who talk negotiate. It was so simple that I felt foolish for not seeing it. Marlene had not drawn a map. She had not conducted spatial analysis. She had understood something about human beings that my cartographic framework could represent, but never generate the knowledge that borders dissolve not through removal, but through repeated crossing. I implemented the mixed kitchen rotation that evening. Warren accepted it because it was logistically rational. More hands in the kitchen meant faster meal prep, meant more efficient use of the camp stoves. Dale accepted it because Marlene told him to. The others accepted it because nobody wanted to be the person who refused to cook. Within 3 days, the meal-based mixing began to bleed into other spaces. Ethan taught 2 of Warren's younger members how to maintain the ventilation dampers. Kendrick and a man named Saul from the bus group rebuilt a collapsed bunk frame together and spent an hour afterward talking about their respective military service. Skylar, still nonverbal, began sitting beside Lily, Tom, and Grace's daughter during meals, and the 2 of them developed a communication system based on drawings that Skylar produced in the margins of my inventory ledger. The borders didn't disappear, but they became permeable, and permeable borders are the cartographic definition of a functional boundary rather than a barrier. Grace's prediction held. The infected were dying, not from us, not from the military, which had gone silent on every frequency we could reach. Not from any intervention, treatment, or resistance. They were dying because the pathogen that animated them was consuming the biological machinery it required to persist. Grace called it parasitic burnout, a term she admitted she'd invented, but which captured the observable reality with enough precision to be useful. On surface runs, we documented the progression. Infected that had been mobile in weeks 1 and 2 were stationary by week 4. By week 6, they were collapsing, not falling as though tripped, but subsiding, folding downward in stages as muscle groups failed sequentially. By week 8, the ridgeline observers reported no moving infected within visual range, and the valley floor, viewed through binoculars from a high overlook, contained only stillness and the scattered shapes of the fallen. The smell reached us even at elevation. It was the smell of biological process completing its final transaction, and it pervaded the forest with a sweetness that made every surface run an exercise in controlled breathing. I updated the map. The green zone, our safety margin above 2,000 feet, expanded downward as the threat receded. New areas were marked for exploration. The scavenging radius grew, and the question that had been abstract when Grace first raised it became concrete and urgent. When do we open the door and not close it again? The answer was not unanimous, and the disagreement was not between the 2 groups, but within them, cutting across every faction, family, and friendship in the bunker. Some people, Dale foremost among them, wanted to stay sealed until the last possible infected had been observed motionless for a sustained period. Others, led by Warren, wanted to begin surface operations immediately, establishing gardens, water collection, permanent shelter. The spectrum between these positions contained 41 individual calculations of risk, memory, and desire, and no map I could draw would reconcile them. I called a meeting, the first formal all-hands gathering we'd held. We packed into the C&C room, standing room only, facing the wall map that had grown over 2 months from a sketch into a dense, annotated, multi-layered document that contained everything we collectively knew about our world. I didn't make a speech. I'm not that kind of person. I pointed at the map and said, "This is what we know. The threat is declining. The rate of decline suggests full cessation within 2 to 4 weeks. We have food for 6 weeks at current rationing. Water is stable. The question is whether we transition now, incrementally, or wait." Marlene spoke next, and what she said reframed the entire discussion. The question isn't when we leave. The question is what we're leaving to become. If we go out there to scavenge, we're refugees. If we go out there to build, we're settlers. The answer to Joel's question depends on which of those things we decide to be. The room was quiet. Theo, now speaking in short sentences after weeks of silence that Nora attributed to trauma response and Marlene attributed to stubbornness, said, "I want to see the sun." It was not a contribution to the strategic debate. It was a statement of need so fundamental that strategy bent around it. We voted. Not formally, no one raised hands or counted, but through the organic consensus mechanism that the bunker had developed over weeks of cohabitation. People spoke, others nodded or didn't. And the weight of agreement settled like sediment until the shape of the decision was visible. We would begin surface operations the following morning. Teams would clear and assess the immediate area. Construction of exterior shelters would begin within the week. The bunker would remain the core, the retreat point, the water source, the winter refuge, but the surface was now ours to claim. That night, I lay on my bunk and stared at the concrete ceiling and thought about Cass. I had not stopped thinking about her. But the frequency had shifted from the acute, burning signal of the first days to a deeper, slower pulse that accompanied every decision without dominating it. She was alive, or she was not. I would find her, or I would not. The uncertainty was permanent, and I had learned to carry it the way the mountain carried the bunker, not lightly, but structurally, as part of the architecture. I went out first, alone, before anyone else was awake. This was not heroism. This was the private need of a man who draws lines to stand at the edge of the territory he's mapped and see it with his own eyes before committing it to certainty. I pushed the steel door open and walked the 50 feet of corridor and stepped out of the mountain into a dawn that was the color of iron and peach. The eastern sky banded with clouds that caught the light in layers so precise they looked surveyed. The forest was coming back. Not in any grand cinematic sense. The trees had never left, but the small sounds had returned. Bird song, the rustle of something small in the underbrush. The creek running over stones with the percussive chatter that I had not heard since the silence descended in the first week. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and faintly of something else. The residual sweetness of decay that would take months to fully clear, but the dominant notes were green. And alive. I walked to the overlook where we'd positioned our observation post and looked down into the valley. The road was empty. The fields were empty. The scattered houses I could see were dark and still, their stories sealed inside them, unreadable from this distance. Somewhere down there, in the wreckage of the ordered world that had produced county planning offices and GIS databases and property audits for timber companies, were the remains of everything I'd built my identity around. And up here, on a ridge that had never appeared on any map I'd created, was everything that identity had become. I pulled out my notebook and began to draw. Not the valley, not the terrain. I drew the bunker from above a bird's eye view, the kind of plan drawing that architects produce, showing the facility in relation to the clearing, the creek, the access road, and the surrounding forest. Then I drew the surface. The areas we would clear for gardens, the locations where exterior shelters could be constructed against the rock face, the path to the creek, the overlook. I drew it not as it was, but as it would be, the first speculative map I'd ever produced. A document of intention rather than observation. When I went back inside, Marlene was awake, standing at the junction room with 2 cups of boiled water. She handed me one. "How does it look?" "It looks like somewhere we could live." She nodded. Behind her, I could hear the bunker waking the shuffle of 40 people rising from bunks and floor mats, the murmur of voices conducting the small negotiations of shared mourning. Theo's high, clear voice asking Dale for water, the clang of the camp stove being lit in the kitchen. "I need to find Cass," I said. I hadn't planned to say it. It arrived fully formed. The way a survey marker appears when you clear the brush, it was always there. You just couldn't see it. Marlene looked at me over her cup. "I know. When the threat is confirmed 0, when the group is stable, I need to go to Beckley." "I know, Joel. You'll be fine without me." "We will. That's not in question." "What's in question?" "Whether you'll be fine without us." I didn't answer, because the honest answer was that I didn't know. And Marlene didn't need dishonesty from me. She needed the acknowledgement that the community I'd helped build accidentally, reluctantly, through the simple act of drawing lines on paper and watching people organize themselves around them, was something I was leaving. Not just something that I was leaving behind. I spent the rest of that morning on the surface with the work teams, marking garden plots with stakes and string, using my notebook to calculate sun exposure and drainage gradients, and planting schedules based on elevation and season. The work was cartographic in nature but agricultural in purpose. And the intersection of those 2 disciplines, the map and the seed, felt like something new. Not a career, not an identity. Something smaller and less nameable. A direction. Nor found me at midday, kneeling in the dirt with a measuring tape. "Grace wants to talk to you," she said. "She has an idea about the route to Beckley." I stood up, brushed the soil from my knees, followed her inside. I left on a Tuesday, a real Tuesday, because we'd recalibrated our calendar using the position of the sun and a formula Grace found in a forestry almanac. Marlene gave me half the remaining fuel. Dale gave me the tire iron. Nor gave me a medical kit and a look that communicated everything a clinical person cannot say aloud. Theo handed me a drawing of a truck that might also have been a horse. I drove south with my hand-drawn maps under the passenger seat, every road, every contour, every annotation the product of a community's accumulated knowledge pressed into paper with pencil graphite and intention. The route to Beckley was 80 miles through terrain I'd mapped in detail and marked for risk. It would take 2 days. It might take forever. Both estimates were equally valid. I do not know what I will find. I know that I left a door open behind me, the steel door in the mountain, unsealed now, marked on no official map but present on mine, annotated with a single word in my own handwriting. Home. I did not build it. I did not discover it. I drew lines around it until the lines became real. And then I walked away from them toward the one line. I could never finish drawing the one that connected me to my daughter. the map is not the territory. But sometimes the territory waits for the map to find it.